As you know, in Iran, you can't really go in and lead a trauma healing session very easily. The diaspora is all around the world. And God is calling more Iranian Muslims to Christ than any Muslims from any other country. It's amazing stories that you hear. And so because of the constraints, this is the first time we're doing trauma healing television programs. And so we'd like to show you just a little overview of that.
همشونو ببری.
خدا تمومش کن.
خدا اون آشغال یه بار دیگه تو زندگیم ببینم میکش.
اوکی تمام بله.
و برای مشاوره و شبانی نزد ما هم بیایید. البته اگر فرصت دارید.
اگر از میوه آن بخورید و یا حتی لمسش کنید میمیرید.
پسرم به خانه خودت خوش آمدی.
خدا بنده چه میشنم فرزندم، خون تو نزد من فریاد برمی آورد.
دیگر هیچ فرزندی نخواهم داشت. او همه چیز مرا از من گرفت.
مرا ببخش. به شفای شما نیاز داشتم. پرستو باید ازش جدا بشی.
نمیتونم لیلا، اون شوهرمه، من دوستش دارم. نمیتونم اصلا به قول پیمان شاید من دیوونم.
از قدیم راست گفتن دوست ناباب بلای جونه. خودتو تو آینه دیدی چه بلای سر خودت آوردی؟
یاسمن چی؟ با اون که دست نزد.
جعفر تو خدا یک کار نکن که پشیمونی به بار بیاد.
جواب منو بده، میگم یاسمن چی به اون که دست نزد؟
نه
برداره. عزیزم ما میتونیم به منجی عزیزمون عیسی مسیح اعتماد کنیم تا به واسطه سوزوندن اینها باور کنیم که او قادره غمهای ما، دردهای ما، رنجهای ما رو برداره. آمین.
آمین.
And this is Nahid Sephari, the General Secretary of the Bible Society of the Iranian Bible Society in Diaspora.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here among you and share what God is doing among Iranian. Iranian, we have lots of wounds, lots of trauma. I know all the nations, all the people they have, but maybe Iranian a little bit more, and some nation a little bit more, not just Iranian. Having bad revolution, having war, many years of war, having bad government, I can say. You can hear it in the news every day, what's going to happen in Iran. So many traumas between the people. And people really, they don't know what they have to do. So many of them, they get out of the country like me 20 years ago, and some people are still inside Iran and they have a trauma. Some people, they are in refugee highway and they have lots of trauma. This story, you watched it here. They are real case story, which everyone, when they can see that, they can feel themselves in that story. For very first time, we had our first section in 2 weeks ago in Germany, and when we showed these movies to the people, each of them, they felt it's their story. They felt themselves in that movie. Oh, it is not just me, I have this. That lady have the same problem. That lady forgive. That lady been healed, so I can be healed too. This story, sometimes it's good to have a story. All the preachers, when they want to preach, at first they are giving a little bit, maybe some little story. Hearing a story is very well. And all these trauma healings books, each chapter start with a story. But having story in action and in drama is something else. You can feel yourself in that story. You can see the tears. That tears comes from that lady in that movie. It is me, it is my tears. And helps the people to understand the story and the lesson very, very well. We tasted. The Germany, it was Iranian Bible Society's first step in the water. We just put our feet in the water. It was a very deep water. The people were enjoying the drama, and they enjoyed the classes. And as soon as the classes finished, they put in the Facebook. We had the trauma healing courses, and it was very well. And I have to say to you, many people, they are asking, where is the next? When you're going to have it in Netherlands? When you're going to have it in Turkey? When you're going to have it there and there and there? And they are asking for more. Thank you very much, and please pray for Iranian Bible Society, because we are not functioning from our land. We have to function from Diaspora. Thank you.
For those of you who are new, Dr. Diane Langberg is the co-chair of the Advisory Council. Back in 2010, then head of the trauma healing here was John Walter, and he invited us to come in and do some evaluation of the trauma healing materials at that point. And we have been cheerleaders since then around the world, especially for Diane when she's going to speaking in places like most recently Cambodia, which may show up in her talk today. These things tend to happen. But for those of you who don't know, Diane Langberg is a psychologist here in the Philadelphia area. And I've always been asking her to be honest about how many years she's been doing this work. And she has been more honest of late. I think she said 45 yesterday. And so we have, it's still 45 yesterday. Somebody might need to do the math. Maybe she started when she was 12. I don't know. But we welcome you, Dr. Langberg, and come bring us the word.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. It is still 45. I would like to just do a little introduction before the talk, because we're going to speak about generational trauma, which means that the worst that humans can do to humans is passed down through the generations. So that means it's not pleasant. It's ugly. It's almost unbelievable sometimes, and it is utterly overwhelming if you really listen and let yourself down into it. So that means that starting now until the end, you're going to feel overwhelmed. Welcome to COP. However, what I would like to do is invite you to stay there. It is human beings' natural reaction to push that away and distract and everything else. But as I always tell young therapists, that when you are sitting across from a trauma survivor, part of what you end up is feeling their overwhelmedness, feeling their anxiety, feeling those things. Let that feeling inform you just a little bit of what it's like to be those that we're talking about. And I would also like to promise you that at the end, when I have the closing remarks, I will leave you with lots of hope. So it's out there, but go through the experience first so it can inform you, because after this is over, you get to go home. People who live with this often don't even know what a home feels like. So come with me into generational trauma. Every human life, without exception, is a force in this world. Our influence, our impact flows out of us perpetually. It never stops. You think about the tiniest newborn who can influence busy or sleeping adults in the middle of the night. Now, hopefully that influence stirs those adults to wake up and care and feed for that tiny dependent baby. If those adults refuse, turn a deaf ear, or harden their hearts, rejection, not care, then becomes the foundation of that tiny life. It is its beginning, its roots are in rejection. So obviously the most helpless influence us. And then we must choose how to respond to that influence. So it's determined in part by their need, and secondly, by our chosen response. An exhausted adult can readily and sweetly respond to those cries at 3 a.m., or a responsible adult can respond in a way that looks pretty good, but underneath they are forming layers of anger and resentment, which becomes the felt undercurrent over the child's life. It goes without saying that the response of the adults in turn shape that malleable child. It is an important principle, this principle of influence, if we are going to understand generational trauma. In the 1960s, the concept of concentration camp syndrome or survivor syndrome began to be noticed and labeled by clinicians in Canada. They were seeing children of Holocaust survivors. And so these children were coming and asking for treatment, and it was apparent that they also were suffering from trauma symptoms. Further down the line over the years, the grandchildren of those survivors were found to be overrepresented by 300% in referrals for counseling and things as compared to the general population. So these are the grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors, represented by over 300%. So at first, when they encountered the phenomenon, they said the children have secondary trauma. But when the same symptoms were evident in the third generation, a new term was born: intergenerational transmission of trauma. So here's what I hope that we can do with this topic this morning. First, I want to give us just a few theological underpinnings. Thanks. Theological underpinnings to help us understand this idea of things being passed down through the generations. And then second, look at some of the psychological mechanisms that favor the transmission of trauma across the generations. And we will look at those in the context of child development and parenting, and how a traumatized adult transmits trauma to a child. Third, generational trauma can also be transmitted not just through personal identity, but also through social identity. I think we have a taste of that from what we just heard about Iran. Community and national identities can reinforce trauma not just by beliefs or by the way history is told, though those certainly do that, but also by way of enduring social structures, which we'll talk a little bit about and Phil will talk about. We're going to consider just briefly a few case studies in that segment. And then finally, most of which has to wait until Thursday, what do we do? How do we respond to massive multi-generational trauma? How do you do anything except feel overwhelmed? What does it look like to bring the grace and truth of God to that? There is indeed an answer. So first, go back to the beginning of life with me. And God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the world. And he told them what? To bear fruit. And I think that means a lot more than just babies. Bear fruit, be creative, make beauty everywhere in all the avenues that humans have. Multiply, he's saying, make more of what I have already made, which is creatures in my likeness. Make more in my likeness. Transmit my likeness down through the generations. Fill the earth, command it for good. Adam and Eve were abundantly blessed by God so that they in turn might bless the earth and the succeeding generations, multiplying the likeness of God everywhere they went. In Genesis 12, after things got all blown up, and humans were no longer passing down the blessing of God to others, God says to Abram, leave your country, your national identity, your relatives, your family identity, your place of origin, where your roots are. And I will make you, which I think probably means I will remake you, into a great nation and bless you, and in you, what? All the families of the earth will be blessed. That includes us. In both these instances, God is seen as pouring down his blessing in abundance down through the generations, even after humans sinned. Obviously, that tells us something about our God, doesn't it? But it also tells us something about being human. Humans have been created to pass down what they have. It's simply part of who we were made to be. We can't help it. It's in us. Sadly, as with all things that were originally made to be, the mechanism meant for the abundant blessing of generations has been twisted and ruined. So humans continue to pass down to others, but as we know, it is often not blessing that is transmitted, but disease and ruin and trauma instead. Scripture is also replete with references to God responding to ruin with another promise of blessing. Isaiah 61:4, they will rebuild the ancient ruins. They will raise up the former devastations. They will repair the desolations of generations. Zechariah 8, old men and women will sit in the streets, and the city will be filled with boys and girls playing in the streets. So the most vulnerable, the elderly and the little ones, will be safe in the streets. God will restore a place of safety and blessing to humankind. Lastly, Psalm 106, which was also sung by Mary, God's mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation, and his faithfulness to children's children. Humans, you and I, were created to transmit blessing. The mechanism remains. You and I, however, often see as part of our work the tragic suffering and evil that results in traumatized humans rather than blessed ones. Now, when we first started talking about trauma in this country, we used to think of it as an event, and there were distressed human beings after the event showing certain symptoms. And that can certainly be true. But we are now recognizing that trauma can be a multifaceted, long-enduring part of life and do long-term damage to body, mind, heart, and soul. It is crucial in our desire to relieve suffering and speak truth that we have some understanding of the nature of trauma and its effects on the transmission of generational trauma. Otherwise, the work that we do will not be based on this all-encompassing and overwhelming reality. So it's my hope that after today, we will see clearly the profound and often overwhelming results of trauma reverberating not only down through the generations, but down through the centuries. It is also my hope that we will be encouraged as the week goes on and recognize that bit by bit, with one at a time, in one little life, where trauma ceases to govern and hope springs up, that God, by his design of humans, will take that tiny little bit of healing that your life and work transmitted to another and not only bless that person, but future generations you will never meet. It's an abundant outcome beyond our ability and comprehension. He can and he will rebuild ancient human ruins through us, piece by piece. Researchers have identified several psychological mechanisms that seem to lead to intergenerational trauma. Most of those fall under the diagnosis of what we now refer to as complex trauma. Complex psychological trauma is different than PTSD. It tends to involve stressors that are repetitive, often for years or even a lifetime, and chronic. It involves direct harm and or neglect by those who should have been caregivers or because of the utter lack of caregivers. It occurs often at developmentally vulnerable times in a life and has the potential to severely compromise human development. PTSD is not a significant diagnosis for those who are marinated in abuse and terror over an extended period of time. Complex trauma involves interpersonal violence that is usually repeated and chronic with profound relational betrayal, deception, and coercion. It includes things like child abuse of any kind, physical, sexual, verbal, emotional. It includes chronic neglect. It includes those who have lived through genocidal regimes, those who were tortured as war criminals, those who have been relentlessly abused by religious figures. It includes things like slavery, domestic violence, and extreme poverty. What that means is that how the brain works, how the body works, how the self is understood, how thoughts are organized, how the world is labeled, emotions named and regulated or not, and how relationships are understood and conducted, all have their roots in the life-destroying acid of trauma. So think with me about one individual case. This is a little girl who was born into a very violent home who was supposed to be a boy. And the very first incident in her tiny life when she's brought home from the hospital is to have her father's cigarettes put out on the bottom of her baby feet for the audacity of showing up as a female. She goes on in that lifetime as a child to be raped by father, brothers, uncles, males in the extended family, and anybody who would pay for her. She was frequently chained to a radiator and forced to eat with the dogs. She had to find food in trash bins, and by the age of 12 was trafficked across state lines by her father. This is a human being, though she did not believe herself to be one, actually, created in the image of our God, who has known constant distress from birth, from which there was no escape, constant fear, gross insecurity, negligence, instability, pain, ridicule, you name it. This is a person who never once knew the experience of pain followed by comfort and safety. Now you think about your own children or children you know. They fall and skin their knee. What happens? Somebody runs and helps them and kisses it and makes it better. That's just a tiny thing in the scope of life. She never knew that connection of two things like that. So for many people, trauma is not a terrifying event, followed by care, but an utterly and relentlessly terrifying life. And if there is any respite during their lifetime, it usually comes in the form of alcohol, drugs, self-injury, or dissociation. Those are their medications. So as a result of chronic interpersonal trauma, the individual develops constant vigilance, constant anticipation of danger, chronic anxiety, and terror. Fear is not strong enough. They are never at ease. All the person's psychological energy is bent by necessity toward protecting themselves, coping, surviving, not toward learning and growing like children are supposed to be doing. So rather than learning and imagining and experimenting, they are instead learning to be afraid, to hide, and to self-protect. They have been betrayed. They have been separated from those who should be caring or would have been nurturing. They cannot find or seek assistance or safety anywhere because there is no safe person in their world or because of ongoing threats in their lives. Please keep in mind this does not just happen to children. It also happens to adults. Obviously, children are much more malleable, but we never stop being malleable as human beings unless we're dead. So while we live, we are still learning and being shaped, and therefore we can be significantly damaged. And adults have been significantly and unalterably damaged under Hitler, under Pol Pot, in Romania's Pitești prison. Adult Native Americans, with everything ripped away from them, permanently damaged. Slavery in America, generations permanently damaged. Also keep in mind that trauma is not just something that can happen to one person, but to an entire group of people. Ask those who have slaves in their background. Ask Native Americans. People who have lost home, way of life, traditions, children, faith, language, community. It is crushing on a human being and its impact. It destroys personhood. So I want you to do something. I'm going to take us briefly through what are called Erik Erikson's stages of development. But before I do that, I want you to think of one child or two. I don't care who it is. It could be you when you were little. It could be your own child or a child in your life. Or it could be a child that you know who's been traumatized that you have worked with in some fashion or had contact with. And I want you to think about that child or two when we go through these stages and what would happen to them if the things that they should have been learned were not learned and trauma was instead the governing force. Do keep in mind that the brain of a child is not fully developed until 24 years of age. And we give them car keys. So think about the girl I just described. She ran away from home at 14. She had an extended family history of sexual and physical violence, shame, humiliation, scrounging for food, and addictions. Her brain had been marinated in all of that. She hits the streets at 14 because she can't stand it anymore. And she's picked up by somebody she will now call Daddy and experience more violence, humiliation, and addictions and deceptions and violations as he sells her. Her brain will continue to marinate in that for about 10 more years. So keeping all that in mind and the child you've chosen, listen and see what's happening to a developing child created purposefully in the image of God. First stage, birth to 18 months. The child is developing an attitude of trust or mistrust. And they're learning whether or not hope is a thing that exists. So the major emphasis, obviously, in the first year and a half is on the mother and the father's nurturing ability and care, particularly in terms of visual contact and touch. So the child will develop optimism, trust, confidence, and security if properly cared for. I cry, mommy comes. I cry, daddy comes. I fall down, somebody picks me up and comforts me. That's developing trust. It's also hope, because I cry with hope. I ask for help with hope. If those things aren't happening and those responses are not there, you already by 1.5 have started a chronic level of anxiety in a child and general mistrust of the world. And if there's hope, it's very fragile. by 18 months. Second stage, 18 months to 3 years. This is when the child begins, it's the toddler thing, the autonomy. I can do it by myself. But there's also, or the possibility, if that doesn't begin to happen, is the feeling of shame becomes powerful in the child's life. You stupid kid, what'd you do it like that for? Well, I did it like that because I'm 2. But if you get talked to like that, you develop a sense of self that is full of shame. And the child is learning that they have a will. They can make choices. Mommy says, do this. They don't do that. They exercise their will. So during this time, children tend to be very vulnerable because they can easily be shamed. And oftentimes it happens simply because they try something new, because they're quite adventuresome then, and it doesn't work. And how you respond is critical because they can feel shamed by the way you respond. 3, preschooler, 3 to 5 years. Here the things are an attitude of initiative or guilt. And they begin to develop a sense of purpose. I'm actually a person who's here, who can do things, and I'm here for reasons. Children this age copy us. They want to be little adults, They're playing out their roles in a trial universe. So they make up stories with dolls and soldiers, and they play with toy trucks and toy phones and all that kind of stuff. Little mini grown-ups. It's also the stage where you hear the most wonderful and annoying question, why? The main relationship in this stage is the network of the whole family, not just mommy and daddy now, but beyond that. And the sense that I belong to this group and I am valued. I'm worth something to this group. I have a voice and I have a purpose. The family is the safe base. When that does not happen, because children at this age are, in case you have forgotten, utterly egocentric. Yes? So if something bad happens, whose fault is it? The child's. So when I sit across from an adult survivor of sexual abuse all throughout childhood, it wasn't daddy or grandpa's or the neighbor man's or whoever's fault, it was mine. And many of them have been told that if you weren't such a bad girl, I wouldn't have to do this. So that whole sense of self then is marinated in being labeled bad. 4, school age, 6 to 12 years, attitude of being industrious or feeling inferior. And what they're developing is a sense of competence or not. So they're learning and creating and developing new skills and knowledge in school and a sense of industry because they have homework and they have things to do, and they learn that they are competent to make things happen. If I do this, this is the result. If I don't do this, this is the result. This is a very social stage. It's a place where children can easily begin to feel inadequate and inferior. As the world expands a bit, their significant relationship goes out from the family and becomes school and neighborhood. Then adolescence, 12 to 18. Identity or role confusion. I'm not really sure who I am or why I'm here. And learning a sense of fidelity. And part of what that means is the integrity of the self over time. I am this person, I can do these things, I'm not so good at those things. I like this, I don't like that. This is the same self I am over time. When children are abused and neglected, that sense of self does not develop, or it's constantly changing depending on who's abusing them how. So this is the season of learning about right and wrong, making choices socially and things like that. But you think of that little girl that I described. Her sense of self at this point is impaired and twisted. How does somebody at this age develop a sense of morality when they have never had anyone treat them morally? Where's it going to come from? Who am I? What is my purpose? Where do I belong? Do I make choices that have integrity? Young adult, 18 to 35, developing intimacy, solidarity versus isolation. This is when connections are made relationally. This is when people get married and make babies. This is when people have groups of friends or groups of working friends that they connect with and things like that. And again, if you have no sense of self, if you've always been the bad one, if you feel utterly incompetent and are constantly anxious and everything else, what do you want to do around people? Run. You find ways to hide, which could be literally not being with people, or it could be drinking a lot of alcohol whenever you are, or something like that. And then you go on to the grown-up people, the 40s to 65s. So you think about having a life like this girl did. You know, what is this person going to be like as an adult? Not productive, highly wounded, not feeling worth anything to anybody. You know, 40 to 65 is when adults start to think about legacy or how to bless others in your own family and otherwise. And then late adult, 65 and up, you either have a sense of integrity across your lifetime or you may develop a sense of despair. If you've had chronic trauma, it's pretty easy to see what you have. So, what do we have in those with complex trauma? Mistrust, no hope. Shame, no sense of ability or choice. Guilt, no purpose short of survival. Inferiority, not competent at anything. No sense of self or identity, no sense that this is who I choose to be. No integrity of the self. Isolated, no experience of love, ever. No safety in relationships, no sense of purpose except survival. Despair, hopelessness, lack of purpose are predominant. The person has been altered, shaped by chronic, complex trauma. That has been the greatest shaping force in their lives. They've been incubated in mistrust and despair and fear and worthlessness and hopelessness and shame. Now, again, I said this can happen to adults. You can take an adult with a relatively healthy childhood and throw them into Auschwitz, or throw them into Petsesti prison, or Tuol Sleng, the torture prison in Phnom Penh, or traffic them, or rip them away from their continent and their family and their tribe and put them on a ship and take them back to your house and make them a slave, or remove them from their own land and take their children and destroy all they hold dear, and you will utterly traumatize those adults to the extent that the former identity and structure of the self is dismantled and crushed. These are the things that have been woven in and shaped who the person is. Because you see, complex trauma is not just about feelings and thoughts. It's about the I am. Not I feel this, or I think this, or this was done to me. I am this. Now, I'm not going to give you a study of complex trauma today, but I do want to give you the aspects of it that research has shown are most likely to lead to transgenerational trauma. They create a fertile environment for passing on trauma. So one of these, they have a significant impact on parenting, and that's why. One of these is that complex trauma alters the ability to regulate your feelings and impulses. So people with prolonged trauma tend to overreact to stress. They become easily overwhelmed. Some of them always feel overwhelmed and anxious. They have great difficulty calming themselves. Nobody ever calmed them, so they never learned how. And they are often self-destructive in some fashion. They find it difficult to monitor anger and or anxiety, and they don't do well managing impulses of suicide, sometimes sexual acting out or risk-taking behavior, sometimes modulating with things like addictions and self-harm, like self-injury or something like that. And the interesting and ironic thing, which it took those of us in the therapeutic world a while to figure out, is that these self-destructive mechanisms like cutting, which the therapist immediately wants to stop, actually are sometimes keeping people alive. So if I drink myself under the table, I won't commit suicide. So you want to take the drinking away, which you do, but you can't just do this, because it's literally what keeps them alive, because it pushes the pain down. Second, in complex trauma, we see alterations in attention or consciousness. So if you can't escape trauma, there's no door out, it becomes overwhelming, and people can't use the things that you and I would use in normal situations. You know, if I don't like something, I either get away from it, I tell somebody to stop, or I fight back. Well, that doesn't help if you're 3 years old and in the kind of home I described with this young woman, or if you're in a torture prison. Those things do not work. So when those coping mechanisms are overwhelmed and there's no escape, there is a huge correlation then between trauma and dissociation. And there have been several studies that suggest that dissociation at the point of trauma is the most significant long-term predictor for developing a trauma disorder. So what that means is you can't integrate your story. It's too big. It's too overwhelming. I mean, how does a 3 or 5 or 8-year-old integrate things like I have described? They can't. So there's no narrative in your head because the narrative would, knock you down. Can't be effectively cataloged, labeled, or understood. And this is certainly true for children, partly because they have a limited vocabulary and they don't understand anything. But if you put yourself in a torture prison, things happen to you and people act toward you in ways that you would never have dreamed of. You couldn't have made them up. So where do you put them? There's no file. And so that's where dissociation kicks in. So you think about it. You're 5 years old. You live in a house where you're chronically neglected, beaten, and raped. And in addition, there's violence from the gang in the neighborhood. And your parents are drug addicts. How do you put that in your brain at 5? You can't. So in order to absorb memories, or we often absorb sensations like what we see or smell or feel, or the cognitive craziness of growing up like that, all of those things, if you put it all in your head at 5 years old, you would be stark raving mad. And the same thing is true for an adult in a place like Patesti Prison or Tool Sling. You would be stark raving mad. So you have to find a way to leave or distance yourself. So that's what people do. Survivors of Auschwitz speak of this. They will say, there's me and there's not me. And the not me is what happened in Auschwitz. There's a book, a fascinating book called The Orphan Master's Son, which won a Pulitzer Prize. It's by a man named Adam Johnson, and it's about North Korea. It's a fictional book, but it is frankly a very realistic portrayal of torture and a glimpse into hell. And the main character dissociates. And his torturers, who are trying to control him, at one point say in the book, he goes to some place, some faraway place, and we cannot reach him. He ceases to react. The character says this, which is quite eloquent. And he's telling you about a torture prison, but this is what he calls it. He says, in pain school, they taught me to find my reserve, a private place where I could go, in my head, in unbearable moments. A pain reserve is like a real reserve, you see. You put a fence around it, you attend to its welfare, you keep it pristine, and you deal with all trespassers. Nobody can know what your pain reserve is, because if you lost it, you would lose everything. When he was being tortured, he used to talk about how his mind and body split. So my mind goes over here to the reserve, and over here is my body being tortured. That's how he survived. And then third, we see distortions in relationships. Obviously, repetitious, premeditated abuse results in all kinds of relational disorders, attachment disorders, as we call them. When an individual is chronically mistreated and abused, it leads often to things like recurring victimization, can't trust, even victimizing others. They're unable to feel close and safe with other people. So they have no model for healthy relationships, so they can't make good and wise choices. I mean, you cannot do what you cannot imagine. You have to have a picture in your head of something, or you can't do it, or draw it, or whatever. So they numb out fear. They often miss warning signs and feel helpless because they are not attached. This significantly affects child rearing. So you think about this. You're with a parent who can't regulate emotions, right? You're with a parent who doesn't attach and connect, and you're with a parent who dissociates, which means you say something to them and they stand there and look at you with this blank look on their face and it's like nobody's home. That's going to affect this little 3-year-old. So if you just take those three things and put them in a parent of small children, it becomes obvious that they too are going to be immersed in trauma. So they're going to lead a predictable, chaotic life because they can't control affect and impulses, right? They see relationships as dangerous, even this size relationship. They isolate, or they really, really become controlling because they're so afraid all the time. And we know how that goes in parenting. A dissociative parent is there and not there. And then you have parents who have flashbacks. So you have a mommy standing in the kitchen who's been in a prison, let's say, or in Auschwitz or something, and all of a sudden she's in a flashback. She drops the pot. She falls on the floor. She's screaming. She's fighting the perpetrator off, and you have a little 5-year-old boy watching who feels terrified, doesn't understand what's going on, and utterly unsafe, which is just like his mommy felt. So if you take all those things and go back to the stages, then you have a child who is likely to have trauma transmitted to them and then transmitted to the next generation. Then think briefly about, this is a lot of personal identity stuff, but which that has to do with who am I and who are you and who are we and how do we learn who we are and all of that. So we develop personal identity, but we also develop social identity. When you develop personal identity in a healthy place, you end up with the fidelity of the self all across the lifespan. Trauma affects the structure and continuity of that self. Just like the Auschwitz survivor, this is me and not me. There's no continuity there. There's no integrity of the self. People who lived with trauma often say, I was, but now I am. So I was before the trauma, but now I am. There's a discontinuity between pre and post-trauma self. So in brutal torture or dehumanizing treatment, people talk about being human, but that now they're not. The trauma eradicated their humanity. They're less than human. Holocaust survivors often talk about how nobody ever asked them their name. They thought no one could deprive them of their name. It never occurred to them. They knew going into Auschwitz or wherever they were that somebody could take away their wealth, their rights, and their freedom and their dignity, but nobody could take away their name. Well, they did take away their name. And in the torture prison in Phnom Penh, in Tuol Sleng, they lost their names. You come in on February 15th, your name is 215. There's no names. It was the number on their shirt became their name. When Native American children were taken away from their parents and put in boarding schools, they didn't have the same name. They lost their home and their parent and their language and their traditions. I was, but now I am. And of course, often children do not even remember the I was if they were young enough when it was taken away from them. Trauma destroys social identity, which is the sense of belonging to a social group with some emotional attachment to that group. That's social identity. It can be your nation, your tribe, your ethnicity, your faith. When we're robbed of those identities, it feels like our underpinnings moved. It's also complicated if you look down through history because there are people who survive trauma by being other than who they are. So you think of the Jewish children in Europe who got different passports and different names, and now they weren't Jewish anymore. And then you think of, as an adult later, trying to go back and find out who your birth family was, and even if you find them, you no longer fit. Because they went through the war as Jews, and you went through the war as Aryan. Many people experience the loss of personal and social identity. And they experience social alienation from being removed from their social identity group. It profoundly not only affects them, but profoundly affects the generations. So we mentioned an individual case. Here's one about a particular group of people who not only experienced trauma at young ages, but also were victims of the social structure and national crises, and continue to be so to this day. Communist dictator Ceausescu. His iron rule of Romania resulted in many tragedies and traumas to the Romanians due to decades of brutal oppression and fear and intimidation. Patesti prison is infamous for what it did. The most terrifying fruit of his evil was found after he was assassinated. Thousands of children, diseased and emaciated, basically imprisoned in filth-infested cribs in state orphanages, wasting away. I remember when the pictures came out in the newspapers. Now, 28 or so years later, those children who never had parents, who never had nurture, who grew up in filth, were released from those orphanages, and they went underground into the sewers of Bucharest to live. And they're still there. And not only that, now they're making babies. They live in filthy underground slums. Heroin, glue, paint, and synthetic drugs are rampant, so is AIDS and STIs. These young adults never had a parent. They don't know what one is like. They have known filth and hunger and rejection. They have not remotely had a taste of what it means to be precious and in the image of God. And given the lack of nutrition, sunlight, drugs, the possibility of handicaps in their offspring is absolutely huge. They have never witnessed a good parent-child relationship, so they don't know what to do with the baby. They survive and deaden their pain. And you think back to the developmental stages we considered. The sewer children are raising sewer children, who will raise sewer children, who will raise sewer children. That's a pretty hopeless transmission. Started by an evil despot whose oppression and control bore this fruit, which will now continue for many generations, because the mechanism still works. Or consider an entire nation, and yes, Phil was right, Cambodia. Pol Pot, totalitarian dictator. He orchestrated the genocide killing of 3 million of his own people, which happened to be a third of the population. He emptied the cities, forced them into labor camps. They were tortured. There were mass executions, malnutrition, physical abuse, rampant disease. He destroyed, this is the thing I found most overwhelming and horrifying. He literally calculated, and he says this, he destroyed in a purposeful and calculated way every human bond he could think of. It's like the man sat down at the feet of Satan and said, okay, tell me how this image of God thing works. Well, it's seen this way, and it's seen in these relationships. Okay, I'll destroy this, I'll destroy this, I'll destroy this. That's what he did. Marriage, killed all the fathers. Family, can't be together. Community, nope. No faith allowed. No cultural expressions, no traditions, nothing. These are all very human things that are the means God uses for us to pass blessing. You think of traditions in your own home, growing up or now. You're passing blessing on to your children. He killed it all. Everything that gave people identity or purpose or safety or meaning was destroyed. As much as he could, he wiped out the face of humanity. Many years ago, when I was here working in Philadelphia, a Cambodian pastor asked to meet with me. And he said to me that of all the immigrants in the city of Philadelphia, the Cambodians did not climb. All the others had children who were more educated, got jobs, had more money, and all of those things. They went higher than their parents. That's why immigrants come, right? So their children can be blessed. Cambodians did not, and he wondered if perhaps it was because of the trauma of the Khmer Rouge. He was correct, because what he was encountering was the long reach of Cambodia's killing fields down through the generations, still killing souls on the streets of Philadelphia. Parents and siblings gone for many who had no identity or relationships or knew where they were or who they were. Hideous memories of their own traumatic experiences, somehow trying to build a life. Go back with me to the beginning this morning. Every human life is a force in this world. Our influence pours out perpetually. It is a God-given mechanism meant for the purpose of humans flooding, influencing God's world and all that is in it with his blessing seen in us and given to the next generation. But you look at what we've considered. Instead of blessing, cursing, down through the generations, the concept of generational transmission of trauma is not at all hard to see and believe. And of all people that I know, you all have seen it in your own nations, in groups that you've worked with, in all kinds of places around this world. We said that humans have been created in part to pass on to others what has been given to them. It is simply part of who we were made to be. It cannot be stopped. It can be changed, but it cannot be stopped. And sadly, as with all the things you and I were originally made to be, the mechanism meant for the abundant blessing of others has been twisted and ruined, and so humans continue to pass down to others not blessings, but trauma. So now Phil is going to come and make you feel more overwhelmed. Just don't forget that there's hope at the end.
Okay, so Dr. Langberg has given you a recipe, a terrible recipe, for how you can destroy a person. Beginning from early age, marinated, as she says, on up, and why that would be something then direct transmission would be much more understandable. What we're going to do in the remaining time, about a half hour here, is I'm going to give you another little layer so that we can take a case study and do some of the work. Part of our job here is to bear witness to what generational trauma is, how it functions, so that we can see it, right? And we can stop maybe asking some of those questions, which is, well, why do they do it that way? Why do they do those things? And we are prone to see trauma more from an individual perspective, right? And so we've been thinking about individual transmission. We can understand how a mother might pass it on to her children. We're going to think a little bit about how the system actually maintains that in greater detail. So it begs the question here that we aren't going to answer in this particular session, but it's one that I know many of you have asked. Given the amount of trauma in the world, why aren't more of us just a wreck? Traumatized. In fact, many of us are traumatized, but we still find ways to function. So maybe that's the question, is why then are some of us more resilient after our trauma? These are some of the questions. And you see a little bit in what Diane showed about the stages of development, why someone who's marinated earlier on is going to be less functional for the most part. Some of you have heard about adverse childhood experiences. These are things where you've witnessed, Diane gave examples of these, but these are things where life does not function the way it's supposed to be. There is no safety, no security. You've seen death, mayhem, destruction, abuse, betrayal. There is a cascade effect that grows. So out of adverse childhood experiences, you have people who are finding themselves impaired on a social level, right? An emotional level, a cognitive level. Give enough trauma early in life, and you will not have your full cognitive capacities, right? Of course, then it doesn't surprise us then that as somebody who comes out of that deficit, that they are going to adopt certain behaviors. Diane mentioned this. Cutting, drinking, risky sexual behavior, all sorts of behaviors that will have an effect on their lives and around them, which leads to greater disease, disability, and early death, right? Economists and public health researchers can point to us and show us the actual cost to the community, not just the cost to the individual, but the cost to the community with early death, with the result of these things, right? Well, this is the individual transmission of trauma, and you see this green arrow here. This is where we often, in our trauma healing interventions, are trying to intervene. We are working with people who are traumatized, and we see these behaviors that we'd like to interrupt. It's good to start here, but of course we're starting late in the game with people who are already struggling. back to that question, why are some of us more resilient? Well, it often is a result of this. We disrupt transmission when we are able to give people emotional support. The very act of listening to someone's story says, you matter, I see you, you are somebody of great importance to me. That can disrupt it. Social connections. We see that when people who are taken from their families and made child soldiers, when they are put back in the community and treated as part of the community, they have less problems. They are less likely to be damaged. Bethany Haley Williams and her husband Matthew will be here to describe some of those things to you with Exile International. Spiritual well-being, family, physical, all of these things are some of the reasons why many of you are doing better than your peers, even though you went through difficult things. But of course, the actions of a few people in our community can wreak damage, right? Here's your little Bible trivia of the morning. Remember the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom? After King David, the kingdom split apart after Solomon, right? And fell apart. How many good kings were there in that northern kingdom? Answer, 0. Which kingdom lasted longer? The southern kingdom. Judah lasted longer. Why? Because when you have good leaders, you are going to bring good things to the community. And when you have a repetition of bad leaders over and over, you're going to have early death, as we just described. So, which kingdom returned after exile? Again, God blessed the southern kingdom and brought Judah back. The northern kingdom disappeared from history. We can, for those of you who are not from this area and you come from a warmer climate, we brought you some snowflakes this morning. Thankfully, it was only snowflakes. Where my father is, just a few hours north of here, 30 centimeters of snow is falling. That's a foot for those of you Americans that don't know your metric, right? And actions of a few can cause an avalanche of destruction. Doesn't always seem that way, but how can a Pol Pot exist? Only that there were a few that were willing to support a Pol Pot and create an avalanche. On the way in this morning, on the train, I was reading a story about someone who was considered the Holocaust accountant. He died recently, or is about to, I think, and hasn't served any time in prison. He has just recently been convicted of his part in the Holocaust. He says he was just a cog in the wheel. Well, a cog in the wheel allows the wheel to continue, right? So this is how, one way, there is direct transmission. But I want you to expand your idea of direct transmission. Consider a woman pregnant with a younger, an unborn girl. She has in her body 3 generations. She has herself, her child, and she has the eggs of her grandchildren, all present. When she experiences domestic abuse and violence, the wash of trauma is not just on her and her unborn child, but is beginning to have an impact on her grandchildren, all in one instance. They call this epigenetics. We don't really understand how this works and what the real impact is. There's a lot of, you can find lots of language on this out there. Why is the 3rd generation of Holocaust survivors as traumatized as the 1st generation? This is one of the ideas. Come back next year, we may have more information about how this works. It probably will take a decade. We're still, though, missing a piece of the transmission, and that's where I want to get to in this case study. Remember this adverse cascade that we already showed here, adverse childhood experience leading to early death. It's missing 2 layers, and here are the 2 layers. Social conditions that maintain it, and generational embodiment, where the whole community embodies what's going on. So implicit biases, microaggressions, these are things where a people group, it's not just something that happened to Native Americans back there, but it is happening now. It's not just happening to African Americans in this country. Now then, it's happening now. In your context, you may be able to also identify ways in which social conditions, poverty, etc., continue to maintain generational trauma. This, of course, begs a question about those of you who are using healing wounds of trauma. And you know the three important questions, right? What happened? How did this make you feel? And what was the hardest part? Fantastic questions when you're talking to somebody who wants to express what happened to them. But how do you start with the what happened when it didn't happen to you, but you have just been immersed in this? This is an important question that might shape even the way we think about the trauma that somebody has experienced in front of us. They can't actually consciously give you language for it because this is the way it's always been. So let me give you a case study. Listen carefully because I have some questions at the end for you to discuss at your tables. This case study is actually something from a book I'm reading right now. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration North from the South. Isabel Wilkerson, Pulitzer Prize. You must read this book if you want to know about, in the United States, how the basically Jim Crow South migrated north. And this tells stories of this. And so I'm going to read you actually from this case study. It has some language in it that is a little hard to hear, but it's the reality. And so we are going to live in this reality. The background of this case here you see of George Starling, who's 16 years of age, is that there had been that year a horrific lynching not too far from his community that would have been known. This lynching is almost impossible to describe. This person was accused of having a sexual relationship with a white woman. Turns out he did, but it was consensual. But the family of the white woman decided to have this guy lynched for it. But he wasn't just killed. He was tortured a long time. Parts of his body were cut off that he was made to eat before he died. Imagine this as we start this case study. The grown people's whispers of unspeakable things, like I just mentioned, seeped into George's subconscious like a nursery rhyme, even though he was too young to know the particulars or to understand the meaning of it all. Surrounded as he was by the arbitrary violence of the ruling caste, it would be nearly impossible for George or any other colored boy in that era to grow up without the fear of being lynched, the dread that, in the words of historian James R. McGovern, he might be accused of something and suddenly find himself in a circle of tormentors with no one to help him. By the time little George was old enough to notice, it seemed as if the whole world was crazy, not because of any single event, but because of the slow discovery of just how circumscribed his life was turning out to be. All this stepping off the sidewalk, not looking even in the direction of a white woman, the cern and the mammon and the waiting until all the white people had been served before buying your ice cream cone, with violence and even death awaiting any misstep. Every generation had to learn the rules without understanding why, because there was no understanding why. And each one either accepted or rebelled in that moment of realization and paid the price, whichever they chose. No one sat George down and told him the rules. His father was quiet and kept his wounds to himself. George's teachers, who were they? Fear and instinct. The caste system trained him to see the absurdity as normal. Like the time George went for an ice cream cone at the pharmacy in downtown Eustis. He wouldn't be able to sit at the counter. He knew that going in. Anytime a white customer walked up, he had to step back and wait for him or her to be served first. George had learned this too by now. But the pharmacist had a dog, a little terrier. And when George walked up to the counter, 3 or 4 white men were standing around looking at one another, and then at the pharmacist, the owner called out the dog, and the dog jumped up on the counter. When the pharmacist had everyone's attention, he turned to the dog. He said, "What would you rather do?" The pharmacist asked the dog, "Be a nigger or die." The dog rolled over on cue. He flipped on its back, folded its legs, shut its eyes, and froze. The grown people at the counter up front near George shook with laughter. George was a teenager and outnumbered. He was the only one of his kind in this place. All he could do was stand there and take it. Any other response would require an explanation. "What's the matter with you, boy? You don't like it?" He could hear them saying. All kinds of things, thoughts went through his mind. A whole lot of things, he said, like, how'd you like to kill all of them for one thing? Now, one last little point in this story. On the face of it, this black and white world that George lived in seemed pretty straightforward, but it's complicated. And the case study goes on, and I'm not going to read it, to talk about a black owner of a grocery store who turns out to find out that he's a little higher on the caste system than they are, and he can trick them out of their money as well. And so it becomes a whole caste system. So here's the questions for you to examine. And I want you to talk at your tables about this. And I'm only going to give you probably about 12 minutes because I got 2 minutes to close. What are the social conditions that maintain the systems that transmit trauma? We often think about the individual ones that Dr. Langberg talked about. What are the observable ones? What are the hidden ones? What are then the generational symptoms, generational trauma symptoms that little George, when he grows up, may pass on to his children? And if I could so boldly ask one more question for some of you, which is, those of you in the upper caste, the higher caste members, what are the things that you would likely miss in this story and not see as part of the trauma generational transmission? Okay, good conversations among yourself. Talk at your tables. What are the social conditions? What are the symptoms that might be passed on? Tony is going first. Great.
Just a couple things for what are the social conditions that maintain systems that transmit trauma. Poverty certainly can maintain that. There's power dynamics coming from up above. There's oppression by laws that may be unrecognizable by either the people who make those laws or even the people who have to live by those laws. There's hidden hiring practices and things like that that can prevent people from getting the jobs and being able to get out of the poverty.
Yep. That's great. And you know what? What you're describing are actually the systems are still in place, right? The same things that were designed to keep someone in their place still exist. Different forms, different ways, but they exist. Anybody else at your table, something that came up in the discussion? It could be the second point too. What are some of the symptoms that might be passed on? I heard lots of discussion, so I know you were talking. Yes, go to a mic, Emmanuel, Reverend. We want our fleeting online audience to hear what you have to say.
I'm not sure if I will be able to explain clearly some of the discussions we had, but we realized that there's an issue of fear. And then because of that fear, people keep building systems to protect them. Mm-hmm. So when you see our economic systems, even our justice, there is a sense of fear. Mm-hmm. So people, they don't want to face the issues, and there is unresolved conflict. So because of that, people keep fearing something that can happen again to our people. So they build our systems to protect them.
Excellent.
So this can be, we can see it. We see it several times in Africa, even in America, in many parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, fear drives much, right? Fear drives much, but from both ends. You saw George's fear and what he would pass on to his children to keep them alive, but also fear from the upper caste in order to keep things in balance. Rebecca.
There was a really excellent point at our table about, we talked about fear and about the negative things, but also about how African Americans in the United States can really push their children to excel and to do very well as a response to that sense of inferiority, that they can actually be really hard on their kids and propel them towards success as a response. It's like a counteraction.
Excellent. Okay.
One of the things we discussed was that we live in a racialized society. What George was experiencing is a social construct that America was built on race of inferior, being superior, inferior. And so the system was already in place, but one of the consequences of that, George would pass on to his kids that we're inferior based on the social construct of race, and everything in America was built and done based on a racialized society. There are systems in place that give one race privilege and keep the other races as one down.
Right. Excellent. And within subgroups, you will find caste systems there as well, the same sort of power structures. So in this, as you read, you will find, if you read this, you will find lots of ways that you will have not only, we wonder why we're so separate. Well, we create separate systems, right, that manage it, that maintain that distance, maintain that disconnect, right, that continues another form of generational trauma, right? Again, we're focusing here on this particular case study, but this can happen in any country, in any context. Okay, what's the hope? Remember, Diane said she's going to do this on Thursday, so that's why we keep you around. If you're feeling hopeless, stick around. But there is some hope that I want to point you to. You know, Abraham's promise. Abraham was given a promise by God that he would become a blessing to the nations. One man who was dried up and old and couldn't possibly be considered to be somebody who would pass on anything. And yet, here he was used. What's the fruition? Not in his lifetime, right? But he is faithful, Hebrews tells us. Well, that goes on to Isaiah 49, and I want to read you just a small section. This is Isaiah speaking of himself, but he's actually prophesying about the coming Messiah. And therefore you. Listen to this from Isaiah 49. Listen to me, you islands. Hear this, you distant nations. Before I was born, the Lord called me. From my mother's womb, he has spoken my name. He made my mouth like a sharpened sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor. Now, Isaiah first says, okay, this is what God says, but I feel like I'm laboring in vain, he says. But I have said, I labored in vain, I spent my strength for nothing. Yet what is my due is in the Lord's hand, and my reward is with my God. And this is what God says in response to him, and it does play out to you too as well. He says, God says to him, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant just to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. And we see this blessings of the nation beginning to happen. And Jesus, of course, brings that in and shows us, I am not just here for the Jews alone, but also for the whole world. A few can disrupt the transmission of the many curses and brokenness, right? You have a job. You are to be faithful like Isaiah in something that may feel like it's a total waste of time. It's a total failure. Jesus' ministry looks kind of like a failure, if you ask me. Everybody abandons him. Some betray him. He's killed. The Apostle Paul does all these missionary journeys. Where is this church in Turkey today? It's small. It seems like it couldn't have been very successful. And yet, look at all of us here today. How else could we have been here but for this? We are the disruptors of the transmission. Come back on Thursday to hear more of Diane, give some more hope on that. And with that, I'm 2 minutes over. I apologize.